What's up, PSY-250? Mr. T here. Want to show you something real quick. You see that guy right there in the middle? The super awesome rocking guy, long hair. That's me. The year is 1996. I'm 18 years old, freshman year of college, and I'm a rockin' heavy metal drummer. Yeah, that guy didn't care. He didn't care what he ate. He could do anything he wanted. Girls found him irresistible. Yeah, not a care in the world. Thin, awesome long hair. Yeah, he was ready to take on the world. Dude, those days are over. Before we get started into the Workshop 4 content, I just want to pause for a few minutes and talk about some of the things that we've covered in terms of how it applies to your life and your vocation. A lot of what we've talked about involves theories and kind of some abstract concepts. There is a lot of applicability of this content to not only your professional lives as you go into the psychology, counseling, or social work field. It can apply to your life personally. So let's talk about certain theorists, like Piaget. Piaget said that there's different stages of thinking, cognitive development that people go through. Are you going to interact with someone the same way who's an adolescent as someone who's in middle adulthood? Well, I hope not. Also looking at like Vygotsky and how the social environment impacts us and how we learn from the society around us. Both theories have been really well researched and both are valid. And as I've said before, neither one is 100% correct, but they both apply to what you're doing in your life right now. Say, for instance, you're working with a troubled child in a classroom or something like that. Well, sitting down with a child and saying, you know what, the problem is you're in pre-operational thinking right now. A child's not really going to understand that, but you could take the Vygotsky approach and use scaffolding and kind of step that child through some different processes. Let's say, hypothetically, you work in correction. There's a number of different approaches you can take, but you can take Piaget's approach and try to change their thinking so that they learn new ways of coping and new ways to sort of counteract the temptations and urges that they have. So those are just a couple examples, both in terms of interpersonal relations, also in terms of practical things in your daily life, as well as your professional careers.
Getting old ain't easy. I mean, I know it happens to all of us, but man, I just do not have the energy that I used to have.
Before we go any further, I want to pause for a quick devotional. This comes from Ephesians 4:15. It says, "When we become mature believers, we will no longer be like babies, rocked back and forth by the waves and swayed by scheming people and their deceitful thinking. Instead, speaking in truth and love, we will grow to become the mature body of Him who is the head, that is Christ Jesus." And that's what spiritual development is all about, I think, becoming more like Christ. So that's my prayer for you guys, just that you'll continue to grow and mature spiritually, because that will definitely not only make you more godly, but it will also help you in your personal and professional lives. Okay, so now we'll get into the material. We've talked about childhood, we've talked about adolescence. Now it's time to talk about adulthood. So, specifically, we're first going to talk about emerging adulthood, also called young adulthood, the age of 18 to 25 when we're talking about young adulthood. 18 to 25, you're not really an adult. Technically, maybe in a legal sense, you are, but as we'll discuss later, um, in a lot of ways, it's just not quite adulthood. But young adulthood, for lack of a better term, is the point at which we're leaving adolescence and we're now physically at our peak. Our bodies are the healthiest they will ever be in our lifetime. Our immune system is at its best. We can fight off diseases better than we can at any point in our life. What's interesting to note here, though, is that this concept of senescence really kicks in. Senescence is the point at which your cells actually start to degrade themselves. The brain is actually continuing to develop as well. The brain, a lot of people think that, when you hit your early 20s or whatever, that's your brain has pretty much stopped developing, but that's not true. The brain continues to develop and sort of solidify these neurons and synapses all the way up until age 27. At about age 27 is the point at which it's not that we can't learn anymore. It's not that we don't create any new neural pathways, but the rate at which we learn and the brain makes new connections between the neurons slows down dramatically at age 27. So, in reality, although we call it early adulthood, really the point at which the brain kind of reaches its peak in development is after early adulthood. So this is the point too in which people develop their healthy habits or unhealthy habits.
I need to get back in shape, start exercising more, eating healthier, yeah, Death Star Taco Bell ain't good for my waistline, you know what I mean?
It's crucial that we develop good habits and that we keep them, because those good habits are what's going to continue later in life. So, also in early adulthood is when dialectical thought develops. It is alongside of Piaget's post-formal thinking. And dialectical thought, the way I best remember it is it's the ability to see things from multiple perspectives and kind of see the gray area. So the opposite of dialectical thought is what I call black and white thinking. People who tend to only be able to see things from one point of view. Things are either 100% completely right or 100% completely wrong. And they're not able to really process the complexity and sort of the gray areas. An example of all this would be the concept of war, right? Most people think that war is a bad thing overall. There are some people who think war should never take place. War in all forms is completely bad and should be avoided no matter what. So people who are pacifists, now I'm not saying that that viewpoint is wrong. However, if you think that war is a simple thing, it's a simple moral issue, then that is not dialectical thinking. Dialectical thinker would say, okay, it depends on what war you're talking about, and yes, people killing people is a bad thing. However, let's consider the context in which it develops. perhaps there were some good things that came about because of the war. So, for example, what if we never went to war in World War II and stopped Nazi Germany and the Axis powers? There's a lot of gray area there. And to say that war is always bad is a bit black and white, in my opinion. And so that's just an example of dialectical thought. So another part of early adulthood is people are most sexually active. Married or not, most people in America are sexually active. Your body is saying, let's make some babies while we're still young.
You know, it's like one day you're a Jedi with a hot girlfriend, and then the next day you need a mechanical suit just to stay alive. Aging sucks.
At this point, cognitively, people are thinking about their careers and how they're going to make their lives big and grand. But the body is actually saying, hey, let's slow down and let's reproduce. Which is kind of an interesting paradox. Something else you should be aware of is the millennial culture has what is called the hookup culture, which sexual activity is probably the riskiest it's ever been in our lifetime. That's something that professionally you're going to have to deal with. There are some major consequences of the hookup culture, physical and emotional pain that you'll have to deal with. This is also the point at which psychopathology starts to kick in for a lot of people. The early 20s is the point in which things like mood disorders such as depression or bipolar, anxiety disorders, and schizophrenia, those things can suddenly rear their ugly head. Self-disclosure here, I deal with depression and anxiety. It really started right towards the end of my college senior year at about age 23. Kicked in really hard, and it's something that I've had to contend with my whole life. I've learned to cope with it, and by the grace of God, I've done pretty well overall. You can really see why the risky behaviors that are often associated with young adulthood, such as sexual activity, drinking, drugs, things like that, are really dangerous for people. If you're biologically predisposed to some of these psychopathologies, such as depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, anything like that, you couple that with heavy drinking or drugs or promiscuous sex and things like that, and you can really see this is a very dangerous time in which can be devastating if people aren't careful. Going back to the brain, like I said, the brain really continues to develop until the age of 27. What is called the executive function, which is housed in the frontal lobe of the brain, really isn't developed until about the age of 27. And the executive function is to regulate your behavior, how to calculate risk and odds and things like that. Think about consequences. And when the frontal lobe and the executive function aren't fully developed, and you start throwing in things like heavy drinking, drugs, just risky behaviors in general, and then couple that with a lot of people are biologically predisposed because of their genetics to depression, anxiety, all the psychopathologies, and you can have a perfect storm. And it's no wonder why we see people at this age who commit suicide. A lot of times this is the time in which people start a criminal life, and it's unfortunate we live in a culture where we as Americans think we're invincible, and really we're a lot more vulnerable than we realize. And we live in a culture where we say, hey, you're young, you can do whatever you want, nothing's going to harm you. But people don't realize what's going on with their brain and their biology. And it's really scary. So that's emerging young adulthood in a nutshell. Okay, now we're going to move on to middle adulthood. Middle adulthood is generally thought to be between the age of 25 to 65 years old.
You know, I used to be able to go out in the yard and play lightsabers with Luke and Leia all day long. Not anymore, man.
I'm really going to break it up into two parts. We're going to do 25 to 40 and then 40 on. So I really think that there's two distinct parts of that. From 25 on, though, in general, it's important to know that when people hit middle adulthood, they generally focus on their careers a lot. This is especially true in men. Not that women don't focus on their careers, but men seem to really put a lot of their identity into their careers, a little more so than women.
You know, as I've gotten older, I've just come to realize I just gotta slow down and smell the roses a little bit, you know? I was so career focused back in the day. I tell you what, I was chasing down the rebels in my, Star Destroyers and everything, and, all I cared about was my career. But man, now that I've gotten older, I just need to sit back and relax a little bit. Smell the roses, you know?
Here in middle adulthood is when senescence becomes visibly noticeable. You'll really start to see it at about age 30. But then it especially becomes even more apparent from age 40 on. Things like wrinkles start to set in, and I'm 41. And you see I got a little bit of grays in my beard here. So gray hairs start to come. Weight gain is a problem for many adults. Yours truly included there. Muscle mass starts to reduce. The brain really starts to age. Not so much noticeably between 25 and 65, but the brain physically starts to reduce in size from about 40s on. New neural pathways and connections are just harder to build. The old adage says, it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks. Not to say that you can't learn new things. I like to think that I'm still learning new things. 40 seems to be the mark in which a lot of senescence becomes very apparent. Fertility issues, there are changes in sexuality, reproductive issues for both men and women happen at about age 40. Obviously, menopause is a big thing. Something that's kind of new, at least kind of new to me, is andropause, which is kind of like menopause for men. I wasn't really aware of that. Men have a lot less testosterone, and so sexual drive is not what it used to be, and muscle mass decreases, and for things like menopause and andropause, there are different hormonal therapies that people can do.
Getting old, it's just part of life, and you can't eat everything you want to eat. You can't drink everything you want to drink. You got to think about these things. I want to be around for when Luke and Leia have their kids and everything, and if I keep eating the way I am, I'm not going to make it,
Last thing about middle adulthood, health habits become even more important at this point. hopefully continue those health habits that happened during early adulthood. Also, if addictions such as um, alcohol or tobacco or drugs were a big issue in late adulthood, they tend to get worse and the consequences of them really start to kick in. Yep, that's basically it for middle adulthood. Mostly just talked about the biological perspective of middle adulthood. There are some cognitive theoretical implications, but for the most part, um, people are already in formal operational thought. There's not a whole lot from a theoretical perspective that changes from early adulthood to late adulthood.
I still feel like a kid sometimes. I can do things that my wife doesn't think I'm Casanova anymore, but you know I still make do. You know what I'm saying?